Hello everybody and welcome to Grey History, episode 84, Yesterday's Heroes. In March 1793, the Girondin deputy Vergniaud issued a stark and prophetic warning. The revolution risked devouring its children. 7 months later, Vergniaud was dead. Yet the trials of the Queen and the Girondins were mere appetizers for this serving of the people's justice. By November 1793, the time had come for yesterday's heroes. Now, when I first started this episode, I had a simple idea. 5 people, 5 trials, 1 episode. I'm sure you can guess what happened next. Having researched these amazing individuals, we've got a slight change in plan. So, our finale for the show trials of 1793 will go as follows. Firstly, this episode will cover the tales of the Duke of Orléans and Madame Roland. The former Duke was of course a prince of the blood who notoriously voted for his own cousin's death. The latter was a figurehead of the Girondins, a minister in all but name. With both accused of royalist conspiracies, there's plenty to unpack. Yet I said 5 heroes, so what about the other 3? Well, the episode extra will be titled Dead or Alive, and will be covering the fate of about half a dozen prominent figures of the constitutional monarchy. Mayor Bailly, Jacques Necker, Lafayette, everyone's favourite bishop Talleyrand, these are just some of the figures we'll discuss. And if now was their time on the scaffold, we'll also cover their trials. In the case of a few, the revolutionaries ensured some symbolic treatment for the heroes of 1789. That bonus episode will be available exclusively to the community, and it's available right now. So enjoy these final show trials for 1793, because after this, we'll be marching to the front lines. Yet, at the risk of causing panic and alarm, this podcast is at risk of marching to the scaffold. If you're enjoying Grey History and would like to keep doing so, I could really use your support of the show. By making a donation of a coffee or 2 a month, you can help support history that isn't black and white and enjoy all the perks in the process. From ad-free listening to a spectacular amount of bonus content, why not indulge in even more Grey History and support the show today? There's links in the show notes, on the website, or just Google Grey History Patreon. Remember, revolutions are made by individuals. Of course, it's with great pleasure that I get to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizen, Piper. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Thomas, Yakov, and Mike. Of course, the Republic is in danger, and the nation needs its champions. A special thank you to the amazing champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Britt, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, Danny, Gordon, and Matthew. Finally, there's the great of the greats, the heroes of the revolution, the tremendously generous and fabulous Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Prince That Was Promised. An heir and a spare. It's wise advice for a king. From wars to coups, invasions to murder, few issues define eras like that of a turbulent succession. Proof of this can be seen in the revolution itself. Initially, the lack of children undermined the reputations of the young Louis and Marie Antoinette. The king was seen as weak and impotent, while the queen was accused of seeking pleasures elsewhere. Despite these unfortunate rumours, an heir did appear, but only momentarily. In 1789, the Estates General was jolted by the untimely death of Louis Joseph, the couple's eldest son. The monarchs were naturally distracted in a state of intense grief, but their seclusion empowered radicals to push for the National Assembly. Years later, the young Louis Charles would successfully inherit the throne, at least in the eyes of royalists. But Louis XVII would also die in childhood, reinforcing the precarious nature of succession. Indeed, it shouldn't be forgotten that Louis XVI was himself an accidental king. Louis XV was his grandfather, and it was only the death of his father and multiple older brothers that saw Louis XVI enthroned. How things might have differed if he had remained a mere prince. Yet, while it's natural to focus on the direct heirs of a monarch, it must be noted that the kingdom has other alternatives. For the French nation in 1789, the heirs may have been Louis, but the spare was his cousin, the Duke d'Orléans. Even before the Bastille fell in July 1789, the Duke d'Orléans was a notable political player. In his youth, he and his father had frustrated the agenda of Louis XV, protesting the forced closure of the Paris Parlement. Banished for this public opposition in 1771, this defiance would be the first of many. By the time the Estates General gathered, almost 2 decades later, the Duke d'Orléans was a prominent advocate of the liberal nobility. As a participant in the ill-fated Assembly of Notables, he had opposed the reforms of the king's ministers and championed the summoning of the estates. More importantly, in late 1787, Louis XVI infamously attempted the forced registration of his agenda. With the Paris Parlement resisting and the king demanding action, the Duke d'Orléans publicly declared his opposition. Questioning the legality of Louis's measures, the Duke was once again banished. For this, he became a national hero. Although much is made of Louis's apparent despotism, the importance of Orléans' own actions should not be overlooked. Seen as a liberal champion for the people, the Duke had struck a blow against French absolutism. As Talleyrand himself noted, "The whole history of the monarchy had offered nothing like it. With weapons in their hands, princes of the blood had resisted royal authority, but no one before this had tried to place constitutional limits on that authority." Yet, the popularity and prominence of the Duke d'Orléans was hardly due to one singular act. Rich and political, it is how the Duke used his position which made him a powerful player. Well before the Estates General met in May 1789, the Duke was actively pushing a liberal, debatably seditious agenda. It is difficult to know precisely what were his own words and those of paid writers, for the Duke was employing some of the best wordsmiths of the day. For a time, even the famous Abbé Sieyès was drafting the Duke's manifestos, although nothing became as famous as Sieyès's What is the Third Estate? Nonetheless, these political documents could be lengthy and detailed. While hardly consumed in the intricacies of political theory, the Duke clearly did have a taste for individual liberty. As a prince of the blood, he resented having to seek royal permission to travel abroad, permission he was often denied. Aggrieved by this injustice, the Duke's passion for freedom extended to other progressive reforms. Denouncing press censorship and the surveillance of personal letters, the Duke also promoted more radical policies like the legalization of divorce. While these positions were by no means ultra-radical, these opinions made him the highest profile royal who embraced the cause of reform. However, in addition to sponsoring his own manifestos, the Duke was doing something very modern. In the lead-up to the revolution, one could argue that Orléans was creating a powerful political machine. While his manifestos were being published across significant holdings, the Duke was also funding pamphlets, papers, and labels. In addition to bankrolling the increasingly radical press, the Prince was creating a large network of leading agitators. Just who was using whom is a matter of much debate, but this web of radical and reformist acquaintances was diverse, to say the least. For a time, the Duke was connected to numerous individuals who would become the revolution's champions. Girondins, mountaineers, early Jacobins, all can be tied back to the Duke. Well connected and funding a reformist agenda, the Duke's Palais Royal in central Paris was the embodiment of his political power. The vast estate was his personal property, meaning that the police were unable to patrol the grounds. Consequently, the palace was home to a bustling social scene. Vibrant, debauched, and borderline seditious, it was here that pornographic labels mixed with censored pamphlets and political manifestos. Amongst the corridors, one found journalists, speculators, would-be revolutionaries, high-minded idealists, and no shortage of prostitutes. Scandalous to some, it was a safe haven for others, and the people were of course reminded which patriotic noble had made this all possible. With the Duke advocating reform and purchasing popularity, it's not surprising that royalists saw danger. Presiding over this hive of scum and villainy, this disreputable palace was more than a den of radical defiance. A pseudo-Versailles, the Palais Royal was a court in waiting. Friends could be ministers, radicals could be deputies, journalists could propagate the achievements of a new, enlightened regime. By empowering dissent and promoting constitutional change, it was whispered that the Prince sought the throne. To what extent he did is impossible to know for sure, and there's a big difference between wild dreams and active plotting. Nonetheless, what matters is that while royalists saw risk, revolutionaries spied opportunity. As the revolution commenced in earnest, and as Louis XVI looked increasingly unsuited for the role of constitutional monarch, the question was quietly and repeatedly asked: was the Duke the heir they were looking for? By late 1789, talk of Orleanist conspiracy had become commonplace. The most notable rumours relate to the days of 5 and 6 October, the so-called Women's March on Versailles. Some alleged the crowds were encouraged by Orleanist intriguers, and a plot was afoot to install the prince. The proof of this is lacking, but some respected scholars aren't entirely dismissive. More importantly, contemporaries took these allegations seriously, and investigations were promptly held. Keeping his head down, the Duke departed for England in an unofficial exile. Across the Channel, his taste for constitutional monarchy and for individual liberties were only reinforced. As such, while the revolution radicalised in 1790 and 1791, the Duke remained attached to the revolutionary cause. Proclaiming that the only title he sought was that of French citizen, the Duke's popularity remained untied to that of the increasingly unpopular court. That said, his support was still on the wane. By now, the Duke had returned to France, but suspicion and intrigue were taking their toll. In an age which prized men of virtue, the Duke's ambitious and debauched reputation was the opposite of the idealised legislator. Yet June 1791 changed everything. Or at least, it could have. It was then that the nation was shocked by the flight to Varennes. In the wake of Louis's failed escape, the issue of succession was once again at the fore. So too was that of dethronement. After all, Louis had repudiated the revolution, and his son and heir had joined in the escape. Furthermore, Louis's brothers were now both abroad and had declared in favour of counter-revolution. In such circumstances, was replacing the Bourbons really out of the question? The moment Louis departed Paris, opportunity arose. Could the Duke be installed as a citizen king? Having spent years cultivating a reformist persona, one suited for constitutional monarchy, this was the Duke's chance. Publicly, Orléans renounced any desire for the throne, repeating his assertions that he desired the glorious rank of citizen. However, such modesty was to be expected, especially in an age which viewed ambition as a vice. Consequently, few took note of the Duke's public repudiations, while associates very quietly pushed the agenda. To what extent the Duke approved of any plotting is once again unknown. Evidence is lacking for a credible attempt at enthronement, but contemporaries certainly believed that a plot was afoot. Likewise, for those cautious of conspiracy, links could certainly be made. Brissot, for example, who had not yet risen to prominence in the Legislative Assembly, was already a key player in the Jacobin Club. Here, he was instrumental in the petition for dethronement, which eventually resulted in the Champ de Mars massacre on the 17th of July. Despite his radical beliefs, Brissot had once worked for the Duke's political machine in the years prior to the Revolution. Thus, for those who saw conspiracy, both now and in the future, it was easy to link dethronement to the agenda of the Duke. Ultimately, while the Duke spent weeks denouncing any desire for the throne, the crises of Varennes passed. The Feuillants broke from the Jacobins, the Champ de Mars massacre unleashed the so-called Tricolour Terror, and the National Assembly chose to rally behind the king. Nonetheless, in the debates of August 1791, I did spot a joke in the National Assembly aimed indirectly at the Duke. One deputy remarked that the Duke could not renounce the throne for himself, nor for his creditors. With laughter from the right and murmurs from the left, the joke highlights the less than virtuous reputation of the Prince of the Blood. Like all other deputies, Orléans was barred from sitting in the subsequent Legislative Assembly. No doubt distracted by the financial mess caused by abolishing so many aristocratic privileges, the Duke largely remained on the political sidelines. However, with the outbreak of war in April 1792, Orléans did attempt to gain a post in the army. This was rebuffed by the king, leaving Orléans to go on vacation in England. Given the setbacks of the war with Austria and Prussia, the Duke's absence was not the best look. One silver lining, however, was that he couldn't be blamed for the 20th of June, when sans-culotte protesters stormed the Tuileries Palace and demanded the recall of the so-called Brissot ministers. Nonetheless, links between the Duke and the Brissotins were already causing harm. Despite having left the political arena, the Brissot attacks against the fabled Austrian Committee rebounded on the Duke. With the war starting disastrously, one conservative deputy denounced the Austrian Committee as a mere distraction. The real conspiracy was Orleanist. Labelling Dumouriez and leading Jacobins as the creatures of Orléans, this scandalous speech was greeted with jeers from the Assembly's left. Although largely rebuffed and utterly baseless, this episode highlights the prevalence of conspiratorial beliefs. Months later, in September 1792, the Duke formally re-entered politics. In mid-September, a public declaration renounced his noble heritage and proclaimed him a new man, Philippe Égalité. The new Philippe Equality was playing politics, as he declared himself a candidate for the convention just days later. In this, Robespierre attempted to prevent his success, and for reasons entirely predictable. Cold and Spartan-like, the incorruptible had no time for a prince known for hedonism and ambition. The Duke was in many ways his opposite, but now he was also his peer. Elected as the last delegate of Paris, Robespierre was disgusted by the choice. Critically, he did not forget that Danton had lent his support to the prince. With the Duke, Philippe Égalité, an elected member of the convention, the presence of the former prince in the Republic's constitutional body was, of course, controversial. Ironically, with the Girondins having broken from the Jacobins, they could take up the previous denunciations of a Jacobin Orleanist conspiracy. Warning that Robespierre, Danton and Marat aspired for power, they even claimed that this Montagnard triumvirate was seeking to install the former Duke. The presence of this puppet king provided no shortage of ammunition. The Jacobins themselves had mixed opinions on their new aristocratic peers, with some quite happy to show them the door. This hostility was hardly mollified by the king's trial in January 1793. Voting in favour of execution, the decision to condemn his own cousin shocked and scandalised many. The royalists saw a turncoat, while many revolutionaries didn't see justice so much as shameless ambition. Things came to a head in March 1793 with the rogue behaviour of Dumouriez. When the general turned traitorous, the Duke's own son participated in the coup. Likewise, when both defected to the Austrians, they were joined by the son-in-law of another Montagnard deputy, the Marquis de Sillery. The latter was a long-time associate of the Duke. With the convention having renounced parliamentary immunity at the start of April, the Girondins went on the attack. Leading efforts to tie the mountain to both Orléans and Dumouriez, they moved for the arrest of both the Duke and the Marquis. After all, surely these aristocratic Jacobins were now suspects, their sons having committed treason. In vain did Marat attempt to stop the arrests, but the convention had heard enough. The Duke was permanently detained. In the weeks that followed, the Jacobins turned on their colleagues. Camille Desmoulins, a future Dantonist, denounced Orléans as an accomplice of the traitors. Likewise, ultra-radicals such as Billaud-Varenne saw the Duke as a royalist plotter, a false patriot corrupted by lust for power. With the purge of the Girondins in June, the Mountain had a free hand to pursue their own Orleanist conspiracies, this time one centred on the Gironde. Come 1793, the Duke's trial commenced. Given that his alleged co-conspirators had all been found guilty, his prospects looked exceedingly bleak. Like other trials of late 1793, the proceedings were hardly fair. The Duke was dead in a day. Although the crimes committed by the Duke were allegedly numerous, they can be summed up in just a single word: association. Brought to trial alongside a Girondin deputy, the Duke's once famous network was turned against him. Brissot, now dead, had once been financed by the Duke. Sillery, now dead, was likewise a close associate. Multiple Girondins, either dead or on the run, had wined, dined, and no doubt collaborated with this aristocrat famed for intrigue and ambition. To top it off, Dumouriez had attempted a coup. Assisting him was the Duke's own son, proof of high treason. For the Jacobin prosecution, the question was simple. How could a man so connected to conspirators not be a conspirator himself? How could a man who aspired for a crown not be engaged in royalist plots? The fact that the Girondins had once attacked him and had caused his initial arrest was of course ignored. The Duke was in cahoots with the enemy. Of this, the jury was assured. Tried, sentenced, and executed in just a single day, the show trials of 1793 were accelerating with pace. Chapter 2. From Salon to Scaffold. On the 20th of June, 1792, the people stormed the palace. Armed to the teeth and cornering the king, the demands of Paris were simple. Recall the patriotic ministers. Only a week prior, Louis had dismissed his so-called Bressoan ministry. The political crisis which now engulfed the throne had been triggered by the Interior Minister, Roland. Writing a very punchy letter to His Majesty the King, Roland had done the unthinkable. Insisting that Louis revoke his controversial vetoes, he warned that the nation seethed with discontent and that the king risked being seen as the enemy. In the turbulent atmosphere of 1792, Roland's advice was sound. Nonetheless, such action was improper for a minister, as were his infamous shoes. Scarily, for a court steeped in aristocratic traditions, the people's minister wore shoes without buckles. Thus, just weeks after the disastrous start to the war in April 1792, the Bressoans were dismissed from the king's ministry. The foreign minister, Dumouriez, also departed, ultimately returning to the army. Yet, when the crowds of June 20 lobbied the Legislative Assembly and threatened the king, their request to recall the ministers was a little oversimplified. In reality, the most important member of the ministry had never been a minister. Instead, she was a minister's wife. Irrelevant of one's sources, Madame Roland is one of the most notable and controversial women of the French Revolution. While not as famous as the Queen or Charlotte Corday, her presence through these tumultuous events is nonetheless substantial. For her detractors, Roland was the Girondin puppeteer. Likened to historic female protagonists, she scandalized her contemporaries with her vices and ambition. Often portrayed as a woman meddling in the affairs of state, her gatherings and her influence was a cause for condemnation. Others disagree. Intelligent, brave, and resourceful, it's clear that Madame Roland had far more political skill than many of her peers. For advocates, the fact that her sex denied her public office was a loss to the revolutionary movement. Politics and prejudice besmirch a true heroine, one worthy of celebration. As such, to understand this divisive and influential figure, we must rewind the clock and trace her steps to the scaffold. Born in 1754, Madame Roland was the daughter of a Parisian engraver. The only surviving child of multiple siblings, she enjoyed some formal education, but still less than a comparable son. Curious and thoughtful, the young Madame Roland was intent on making her own opportunities. Self-taught and hungry for knowledge, by 1789 she was very well read. Shakespeare, Plutarch, Voltaire, Rousseau, these were just some of the men she admired. Over time, her intellectual pursuits transformed her from reader into writer, admirer into advocate, housewife into campaigner for philosophical and republican ideals. Unusually for the era, her husband viewed her growing talents not as a threat, but as an asset. In time, this opinionated, outspoken and lively young woman became her husband's equal. Together, they would climb to the highest ranks of the French government. 20 years younger than her husband Roland, the pair married in 1780, when she was already 26. The two shared mutual affection, although much ink has been spilled over what passions were shared between them. Certainly, there was some, as Madame Roland gave birth to the couple's only child the following year. Before the Revolution, Roland had worked as an inspector of manufacturers. On the side, he dabbled in writing essays and papers, eventually authoring chapters for an encyclopedia. These works included studies of manufacturing processes, focusing on the technical aspects of producing wool, velvet, linen, and of course, silk. All riveting stuff. Originally, Madame Roland was his copyist and proofreader, assisting her husband with his writings and letters. However, with time, she gained the confidence to write more independently, both for herself and for her husband. If at first she was reluctant to contradict her partner, the years fostered respect and a typical independence. The years preceding the Revolution can be characterised by boredom and travel. Boredom, as the provincial affairs were not to Madame Roland's taste, and travel, as the couple observed manufacturing practices both at home and abroad. In the decade before the fall of the Bastille, the Rolands spent considerable time near Lyon. As the capital of French silk, this is hardly surprising. After all, Roland was an inspector of manufacturers, one with a specialisation in textiles. Critically, the peculiarities of the nation's second city left an impression on the pair. The Rolands were students of the Enlightenment, and the positions of leading philosophers shaped their political and economic views. Defined by silk, Lyon was dominated by guilds, monopolies, aristocratic families, and endless regulations. For the Rolands, the city was an affront. Like many champions of the Third Estate, the inspector became a firm advocate of laissez-faire economics. Deregulation, simplified taxation, free trade, these were his wildest dreams. Reality was a rude awakening. Inherited privilege, corruption, greed, and exploitation accompanied an economic system that was anything but enlightened. Indeed, Madame Roland wrote that Lyon was the vainest and most disgusting city in France for aristocratic rule. The fact that the Rolands found Lyon so nightmarish is of crucial importance. In a sense, the economic views of the couple were not out of step with other bourgeois intellectuals. Free trade and deregulation were all measures that the National Assembly would adopt. But where they did differ from many of their bourgeois counterparts was their genuine concern for the people. It's as sincere advocates for Lyon's workers that their political careers began. The opportunity to turn concern into change came in 1789. Unfortunately, the Rolands had bigger problems. While the world was turned upside down around them, a range of difficulties demanded the couple's attention. Madame Roland's father, uncle, and brother-in-law all died that year, while her husband had a serious illness which coincided with the Estates General. Nonetheless, Madame Roland in particular made time to track developments in Paris, conversing with friends in the capital. Critically, one of those contacts was Jacques Brousseau, a pen friend who would later shape so much of her future. Already a vocal radical, the then journalist Brousseau actually published some of Madame Roland's writings. Analysing both her public and private correspondence, her revolutionary enthusiasm was exceedingly high. Denouncing the court with great gusto, Madame Roland demanded total revolution. Yet, if 1789 had not been a year of action, 1790 was. Having recovered his health, Roland entered politics. With the National Assembly still sitting for almost 2 years, his chosen arena was local government. Demanding that Lyon needed total regeneration, the people agreed. Popular violence consumed Lyon in February, resulting in the destruction of property and the storming of the arsenal. Although the conservative municipality was now forced from office, those seen as radicals were blamed for unleashing anarchy. Roland, in particular, was accused of inciting a revolt. This was political poison. After much campaigning, Roland failed to be elected directly to the new municipal government. However, he was chosen for a sort of supervisory position which would act as a future springboard. Resignations allowed him to join the local municipality, as did like-minded associates who demanded radical change. But while minor gains were made in government, the streets saw significant success. Encouraged by the trends of the capital, the Rolands and their associates fostered the creation of political societies in Lyon. As discussed in our series on Lyon's Federalist Revolt, these bourgeois reformers found considerable support in the city's working classes. An electoral juggernaut was slowly established, allowing Lyon's clubbists to dominate municipal politics. By the final months of 1790, the Rolandans were making tremendous headway. Roland himself became chair of the Municipal Finance Committee, while associates became the mayor and the procurer. Thus, we eventually get the Rolandan municipal government, a group of committed revolutionaries who would later battle their more radical peers. However, our story turns to Paris, for Roland himself spent little time in the council which shares his name. By the start of January 1791, Lyon was broke. Desperate for financial assistance, the city deployed its best and brightest to lobby the National Assembly. This mission was meant to be brief, but for the Rolands it was anything but. After several months in the capital, the delegation had had zero luck. With the Assembly distracted by no shortage of problems, Lyon's finances were not a prominent concern. Yet, as the Rolands despaired in anger and frustration, there was one silver lining. Paris was the city of love. Loving revolution, that is. As committed radicals, the Rolands could see everything firsthand. The Assembly, the clubs, the wild free press, the couple were now in the thick of it. Of all the sights, nothing rivaled the Jacobins. The duo attended the club 4 times a week, hearing deputies and members debate. By early 1791, the sessions of the Jacobin Club were particularly rowdy, both before and after Mirabeau's death. Well in advance of the Girondins and the Mountain, various Jacobin patriots were already accused of corruption and ambition. For now, it was the triumvirate, Barnave, Duport and Lameth, which held outsized influence. Within months, they would defect from the club and form the Feuillants. Stationed in Paris and attending the Jacobins, it was here that the duo finally met Brosseau. Although he had long been a pen friend, it wasn't until 1791 that the three actually met in person. Famous for judging characters, Madame Roland found Brosseau trusting to the point of imprudence. He was merry, naive, and ultimately she considered him a political lightweight. Nonetheless, she was assured of his moral character, and the three became close friends and trusted allies. While not yet a deputy, Brosseau was a committed Jacobin and a talented networker. Brosseau knew everyone, and everyone knew Brosseau. This would be later used against him with cries of elaborate conspiracies and corruption, but for now it was a political asset. Brosseau's close associates included members of the National Assembly, notably the far-left deputies Pétion, Buzot and Robespierre. The three were introduced to the Rolands and before long dined together with varying degrees of regularity. It's here, as the Rolands' dinners grew larger and more frequent, that we get to the origins of the infamous salon of Madame Roland. Now, the word salon in this context is worth explaining. In the 18th century, a salon was a room which was used for receiving guests. However, in the 19th century, the term subsequently expanded to include gatherings of social elites. Such gatherings were private functions, with guests requiring an invitation. Usually, these cliques had regular meetings with regular attendees. Importantly, calling these groups a salon is an anachronism for the French Revolution, and contemporaries did not use the term salon like we do. Initially, the salon of Madame Roland was attended by staunch Jacobins. These meetings were held as often as 4 times a week, after the National Assembly and before the sessions of the Jacobin Club. Its attendees included many future Girondins, but also future mountaineers. Robespierre was then a friend of the Rolands and attended meetings periodically. The purpose of these gatherings was simple. The salon provided a private opportunity to share thoughts and ideas. From parliamentary tactics to specific policies, a variety of subjects were discussed. At first, such discreet deliberations were hardly problematic. Much of the city's radicals were united in both aims and attendance, while conservative opponents were equally fond of privacy. However, fast forward the clock, and we arrive at issues. By 1792, the Legislative Assembly was in session. Brissot was no longer a mere journalist, but debatably the most prominent deputy of the day. Critically, he and others were lobbying for revolutionary war, an issue which splintered the Jacobins. Relations with Robespierre were fast deteriorating, and the Brissotin clique was on the rise. Come March, Brissotin attacks forced the king's ministers from office, prompting the creation of a new patriotic ministry. Importantly, the National Assembly had banned current and former deputies from serving as ministers. As such, Brissot, Buzot and Pétion were all ineligible, and the latter was by now the mayor of Paris. Having developed both friendship and trust, the inspector from Lyon made an obvious choice. With Roland becoming the Interior Minister in March 1792, the influence of Madame Roland was significant. Already in his work for Lyon's municipality, she had exerted atypical power. As her husband's most trusted associate, she would write his letters, monitor his correspondence, and actively engage in political matters. Furthermore, the sessions of her salon were now de facto meetings of the government. On Friday, the various Brissotin ministers would gather for dinner, discussing policy and politics. Likewise, Monday's meetings would be joined by deputies, with many friends now the most prominent in the Legislative Assembly. Madame Roland's role in these meetings remains ambiguous. Consequently, her participation and prominence is a matter of much debate. Broadly speaking, modern historians see Madame Roland as a remarkable case study in how gender and power intersect. We know Madame Roland was herself conscious of the role expected of an 18th century woman, and did her best to appease some contemporary norms. For example, other women were not invited to her salon, and Madame Roland would not openly voice her opinions in debates. Instead, she would conveniently busy herself nearby, writing letters or playing hostess. Nonetheless, we also know that she was listening to every word, ready to offer subsequent advice to her husband and associates. Likewise, she acted as a key go-between for several prominent allies, and harnessed powers unique to her position. As these were private gatherings, her control of the guest list could be used to steer agendas, advance friends, and freeze out those she disfavoured. And, to be clear, she disfavoured many. As discussed in episode 28, a bonus episode on the Brissotin ministry, many historians are critical of Madame Roland's famous tendency to both judge characters and then hold a grudge. For example, her personal dislike of Danton hindered efforts for reconciliation with the Mountain, and even political allies weren't welcomed with universal affection. Several high-profile Girondins chose to attend other salons, in no small part because of personal tensions with Madame Roland. Yet, while Madame Roland made an effort to wield power discreetly, historians can see examples of her influence. The events of June 1792 offer a clear case. Having written the letter her husband read to the king, Madame Roland is perhaps the most responsible for the dismissal of the Broussauan ministers. Likewise, it's clear she lobbied for allies when it came to staffing the government, securing posts and positions for like-minded citizens. Ironically, some of these friends would become bitter enemies, most notably the future war minister and mayor of Paris, Pache. Pache became a bitter rival of Roland in the Executive Council in late 1792, and, as mayor, he would play a leading role in the purge of the Girondins the following year. But just as historians can find examples of Madame Roland's influence, so too could contemporaries. The problem with this little committee, as Madame Roland liked to call it, was that this was an era which despised closed-door politics. It was also an era obsessed with conspiracy, one distrustful of women in public life, and one consumed by factional feuds. Thus, as the convention met in 1792, and as Roland was reinstalled as interior minister in the wake of the fall of the monarchy, the continuation of this salon became incredibly problematic. As discussed during the episodes on their trial, these Girondin gatherings were portrayed as the headquarters of the Girondin conspiracy. It was here that favours were granted, plots were hatched, and virtue was all but forgotten in an orgy of vice and ambition. Historian Marisa Linton highlights how Jacobins attacked the Rolands, and in the next episode, we'll hear from Dr. Linton herself as we discuss the matters of virtue and friendship in the Revolution's terror. Reflecting the scandalous nature of these secretive meetings, Linton writes, "These dinners were subject to attacks as venues for immoral politics by Jacobin journalists. The most savage characterization of her salon was that by Abbé, who used a stylized argot of the streets to depict an evening chez the Rolands when the virtuous female Roland, in the arms of her little slave, Lantinard, was relaxing for the moral pleasures which her bold husband procures for her. This narrative was familiar from scurrilous accounts of the corruption of the court. In another issue, Abbé compared Madame Roland explicitly to the Queen and to Louis XV's mistresses, Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry. Leading Girondins, Brissot, Buzot, Barbaroux, and others were depicted as Madame Roland's courtiers. Abbé used his narrative strategy to portray Madame Roland and her fellow Girondins as operating a continuation of the corrupt politics of the court, dominated by unscrupulous, amoral women. Abbé repeatedly deployed the phrase virtuous Roland as part of his vicious caricature of the minister and his wife, to hammer home the point that the Rolands were presenting a false persona to the public, and that Roland was a sanctimonious but weak figure, the dupe of a woman. As made clear by Linton, the rebukes against Madame Roland were often grounded in gender. This is one important aspect of her legacy, and her gender defined so much of both contemporary attacks and historian evaluations. Historian Sean Reynolds, perhaps the leading scholar on the Rolands, highlights the gendered subtext of many of these denunciations. In the following quote, I want you to note how gendered stereotypes and expectations mixed with revolutionary ideals to create such toxic and ultimately powerful attacks. It is not unusual to find her described as the Egeria of the Girondins, in terms sometimes amounting to caricature. A gendered subtext suggests that, as a woman, she was a meddler in politics, where she had no business, invariably ambitious, and that her illicit influence round the dinner table or in her salon was unfortunate especially on young politicians who fell for her Circe-like charms. Such images draw on the hostile attacks on her by talented but vitriolic contemporary journalists, Marat, Demoulin, Jacques-René Hébert, all bitter enemies of her husband and the Broussauans. In prison, she wrote, "The people who have said the worst things about me have never met me." Additionally, historian Sean Reynolds writes, Madame Roland was seen by certain of her opponents, rightly or wrongly, as embodying particularly feminine aspects of the old regime, entertaining, intriguing for appointments, using behind-the-scenes influence. The rhetoric of Robespierre's speech quoted above, fashion, vanity, pleasure, show, frivolity, is Rousseauist, and therefore, to modern readers, unmistakably gendered. The virtues are male and austere, the vices are feminine and distracting. If hostility to Jean-Marie Roland came straightforwardly from his position of power, his friendship with Brousseau, and his dealings with the Paris Commune, hostility to his wife employed the words of her hero, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to condemn her. Nobody in the 18th century used the word Sélénier, but later writers have often criticised Madame Roland as primarily a political hostess. As suggested earlier, if we imagine that Jean-Marie Roland had remained unmarried and had recruited a brother or some other male relation to act as his right-hand man, such a person could have enjoyed his private confidence very much as his wife did, influence in appointments, and indeed dining with him. Danton, as we saw, used his friends to support him in the ministry. But a woman in such a position was almost inevitably seen as different. The only previous role models were royal queens or mistresses. It is perhaps worth pointing out that it was journalists such as Marat and Hébert who specifically directed this kind of rhetoric against Madame Roland. More heavyweight enemies, such as Robespierre and Danton, perhaps did her the honour of treating her as a political opponent, rather than simply a feminine meddler. Having met her at close quarters, they may have retained some respect for her abilities, although in the absence of any documents that has to remain a speculative idea. The few genuine eyewitness accounts we have of her presiding at the ministry table stress her discretion and political sophistication, without dwelling overmuch on her charm, a two-edged quality. The picture of Madame Roland as an Egeria for the Girondins obviously contains a substantial kernel of truth, but it has been exaggerated, starting with contemporaries and magnified further by historians. Thus, by the time of the Republic's crises of mid-1793, Madame Roland was a public and controversial figure. For the Jacobin press, the minister's wife and her secretive salon were the antithesis of revolutionary ideals. A woman meddling in the affairs of state, her little committee fostered corruption and vice. Lacking transparency and enabling intrigue, these gatherings were an affront. Of course, the attacks against her, particularly from journalists like Jacques Hébert, were hardly virtuous themselves. Nonetheless, they were tremendously effective. As such, it should come as no surprise that Madame Roland was arrested during the purge of the Girondins in June 1793. Although her husband was no longer a minister, the Rolands were targeted during the insurrectionary days. Critically, Roland himself got away, successfully escaping Paris and reconnecting with Girondin fugitives. His wife was far less fortunate. Despite there being no legal grounds for her arrest, she was detained in prison for weeks, only to be released and legally rearrested just hours later. Originally, the death of this Girondin figurehead was unforeseen. For weeks, the Jacobin-controlled convention attempted to minimise retribution, and lists of traitors and suspects remained fairly narrow when first released. Furthermore, Madame Roland felt that there was no case against her. Until June, the Revolutionary Tribunal had been a relatively toothless institution, and she intended to use her gender to deflect all formal questioning. Reiterating that she was only a woman, she insisted that she had no involvement in political affairs. Yet, as July came and went, so too did her chances of survival. Marat's assassination, the Federalist revolts, the downfall of Danton's moderate committee. In such circumstances, the fate of the Girondins looked increasingly bleak. Within weeks, the Jacobins were denouncing a vast and criminal plot, and the salon of Madame Roland was at its heart. With conspiracy the linchpin of the government's accusations, Madame Roland's little committee was perceived as the headquarters of the Girondin cabal. It was here that the Federalist traitors had hatched treason, and corruption reigned supreme. Assaulted in the press as the queen of this new immoral court, Madame Roland was interrogated several times. Again, she rebuffed her involvement in political matters, a claim that was most certainly a lie. After the trial of her Girondin allies in late October, the authorities commenced proceedings on the 8th of November. 2 days after the death of the former Duke of Orléans, the trial went exactly as you would expect. Once again, the defence was prevented from calling witnesses, the jury was stacked against her, and what evidence was produced proved guilt by association. This process we've seen in previous cases, and the conclusion was no different. Like the Duke, she was tried, sentenced, and executed in just a single day. Her time on the scaffold is often quoted by scholars. Steeped in Roman traditions, she intended to die like the republicans of the past. Allegedly, she met her end with defiance, and accounts differ as to her final words. The expression most quoted remains relevant today. O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name? Strapped to a wooden board and lowered into position, Madame Roland was dead. So too was her husband. Having heard of the imminent execution of his wife, the former minister decided to end his misery. Emerging from hiding in Normandy, the fugitive walked into the woods and claimed his own life. Stabbing himself twice, his body was found with the following note: "Whoever you are that finds me lying here, respect my remains. They are those of a man who died as he lived, virtuous and honest. A day will come, and it cannot be far away, when you will have a terrible judgment to make. Wait for that day. Then you will act in full awareness of the cause, and you will recognize the reason for this advice. Would that my country could at last abhor so many crimes and return to human and social sentiments. J. M. Roland." On the back, additional words were added. "It is not fear, but indignation. I left my shelter at the moment I learnt they were going to cut my wife's throat, and I do not wish to remain any longer on an earth which is covered with crimes." Thank you for listening to episode 84, Yesterday's Heroes. Don't miss the Dead or Alive episode extra for this episode, exploring the fates of more than half a dozen figures from the Revolution's early years. With symbolic executions and dramatic renunciations, there's plenty to explore. Of course, this fantastic bonus content is available for members of the Grey History community. If you're enjoying Grey History, please do your part to keep the podcast on the air. By donating a coffee or two each month, you can help produce history that isn't black and white, and enjoy a whole bunch of perks in the process. From ad-free listening to hours of exclusive bonus content, indulge in all the benefits that come with supporting the show. Just follow the link in the show notes, on the website, or Google Grey History Patreon. One last thank you to all community members, and a special shout out again to the heroes of the revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin R, Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S, and Fernando. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.